the Jews won't eat supposedly meat with blood in it. Well, I don't know how they get rid of it all. And that's another question you might want to ask them. I mean, they supposedly salt the meat. They do everything they can, and that's why kosher meat is actually slaughtered in a pretty impressive manner. I don't think slaughtering any creature is fun or nice to see. If you've ever been to a slaughterhouse, you'll understand that. But at least they don't, it's not carrion, that it's not already dead or something. They are very insistent on this being something very vivid. In any event, I just can't see for Islam and Judaism and exactly taking the meat and eating it. You know, Hebrew National hot dogs are maybe more reliable than a lot of other hot dogs. They probably haven't ground up mice and other stuff in them. They're very careful about how they would prepare those things because of the laws of kashrut, as they call it. But I don't understand how they think they've got all the blood out of a piece of flesh. You know, that I can't understand. I think they do the best they can, but I just don't see that that's so. I mean, that's a law that I would agree with Paul to some extent on, but I don't think he can then pick and choose like he does. For instance, just to make a quick run up here to something in the book of Acts relating to this, which most people, since they don't read the Bible for themselves, they don't feel qualified to read the Bible for themselves. I would like to make you qualified to read everything for yourself. That's what this class is partially about. In Acts 15, when Paul goes up to Jerusalem, because as Acts is behind his position, so it's doing it from his point of view. As Acts puts it, some people came down to his community and said that unless you've been circumcised according to the tradition of Moses, you cannot be saved. And so they got upset about this in Paul's community. He goes up to Jerusalem, and it triggers this thing called the Jerusalem Council. So all the apostles and the elders supposedly meet here. But James is pictured as making a speech, and it's not James, the brother of John, because he's already dead. It's James, the brother of Jesus, and he's alive and he's the leader, and everyone is clearly having to obey him, though Acts doesn't tell us why. In any case, at the end of the ruling, he says, you are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, that means carrion, and from fornication. There it is again, abstain from blood. That's a ruling over the whole church. He repeats that ruling further down here. Let me see if I can find out. He repeats it. Well, that wasn't the first time he made it. Here it is. The first is line 20. I rule then that instead of making these things more difficult, we should send the people down in Antioch a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, fornication, strangled things, and blood. And then once again in chapter 21, just in case there's any mistaking this matter, James meets Paul up in Jerusalem for their last meeting, and James is clearly a very observant Jewish person, sends Paul into the temple, and James is observant and Jewish. What does that say about his brother? I've said in my book, James, brother of Jesus, once you found the historical James, you found the historical Jesus, because the historical Jesus wasn't the historical Paul, which is what the Gospels want us to think, because in fact, Paul never even met the historical Jesus, didn't know anything about him, and persecuted early Christians and so on, and his only knowledge of Jesus is through supernatural visionary experience that he claims to have, and unless you credit supernatural visionary experience, you're not going to credit those kinds of claims. But again, who might argue 200 billion people have? And I think I would say that I'm in a minority of one, because in fact even Jewish people know nothing about these issues. If I said these things to a Jewish person, they wouldn't know what I was talking about, because they don't read any of this either. Anyway, this will, look, Paul, we want you to go in here and do these things so people will know. We have a foreman under vow, Acts 21:24. And everyone in the church are bound to hear that you have arrived. And they have heard that you instruct all the Jews living among the non-Jews to break away from the law of Moses, ordering them not to circumcise their children or to follow the customary practices of the law of Moses. So look, here's what I suggest we do. We've got 4 people under a vow here. You're bringing up a lot of money here. Take these men along with you and be purified with them and pay all their expenses, because we know you've raised a lot of money overseas, including shaving the heads. That's why I read this to my students in the Islam class, because after the pilgrimage in Mecca, Muslims shaved their heads. And they did it in the temple too after these Nazarite oath things. And Paul does it here, and he did it once before in Acts around chapter 15. And then this will let everyone know there's no truth to the reports they have heard about you, and that you still regularly walk according to the law. Well, of course he doesn't, and the reports are true. But Acts, nothing loath, carries on, and Paul carries on. He goes in and does this, and then he calls this a riot. For the non-Jews who have become believers, we wrote and told you of our rulings. They must abstain from things sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from fornication. So that's the 3rd time. Abstain from blood. So then how can you square that with a commandment to drink the blood of Christ even in a symbolic way? I mean, maybe, okay, it's not so at odds, but it's pretty much at odds. Did James and his community know about Holy Communion? I don't think so. I don't think they know anything about it. I think that's totally new. I think it's a Pauline idea. I think it's first announced in 1 Corinthians. The reason I'm talking about it is this law in the Old Testament: do not drink the blood. And then James here repeating it for the early church, and all the early church agreeing to it, and he being over all the others. And Galatians makes that very clear in chapter 2, that when the representative of James came down, even Peter stopped keeping table fellowship with Paul, because at this point he had to follow James's instructions, and he knew Paul wasn't doing these things. So therefore, even Peter and Barnabas started to shun Paul in Galatians 2. You can read about it. So, and that's because James is the leader of the early church, which no one in Rome has ever told us. So therefore, I ask, what is a believing person supposed to do? And if I were a minister or a clergyman, I'd try to answer that question. But since I'm